Let's go ahead and start chapter 13. We are going to talk about craft today. So here are the learning objectives for this chapter. We want to examine the historical distinction of craft and art. We want to identify the visual and physical properties of different craft media, such as clay, glass, metal, wood, and fiber. We want to contrast the techniques and forms used by artists working with craft media. We want to provide examples of objects made from craft media that serve functional, aesthetic, and expressive purposes. And we want to consider the social and cultural meaning of traditional craft forms. And so we start this chapter off by talking about the difference between art and craft. And the real difference between these objects are that craft is more of a useful object, unlike a work of art where works of art are basically there to make us feel or think something, opposed to a craft where the actual object has a particular utilitarian purpose. So when it comes to craft, I kind of wonder, what do students think about when they think of that word? I know that in the past, even today, I still think of crafts as things like paper mache, or I think about things like um, textiles. I think about cups. I think about rugs, and so in a way, those do fall into the category of useful objects in comparison to what artwork is really made for. And so the thing about craft in today's standards, many artists are challenging this notion of function. And so if we take a look at this first example here, you're probably looking at this and thinking that it looks a little bit like a pattern or design that you would see on a wallpaper. And if that's what you're thinking, that's what this is actually. It is a bit of a wallpaper design. And despite it being a pattern for a particular purpose, in other words, a, a wallpaper to help keep the wall clean and to keep it flat, it also has a lot of creative value. And so this work here is by William Morris. The piece is called Windrush. And so if we can think back at the printmaking, you could probably guess that each color here was made by a different wood block. And so we're going to talk about one of the more popular media when it comes to creating craft, which is clay. Clay is a soil with a heavily volcanic makeup mixed with water. And with clay, you make things like ceramics. Ceramics is this study, the art and science of making objects from clay. If someone is a ceramist, that makes them someone that makes any work with clay. Potters are people that specialize in making dishes. And in order for potters or ceramists to create these works, for the most part, they had to fire a clay object at a high temperature in a kiln oven. So a lot of different terminology here. And when it comes down to talking about clay, there are these major types. The first one is earthenware. Earthenware is porous, and they were fired at a very low temperature. And when it comes to earthenware, you could say that it is a little bit more accessible than the other types of wares. One thing that you might want to do is, if you have dishes at home, and that if they are any kind of ceramic, or they are made from clay, you could probably read in the bottom what kind of ware it is. And you have to be particular when it comes to cleaning these things because they have different sturdiness. And so earthenware is it's more the more accessible type. There's more earthenware than the other types of wares. It's a little bit cheaper than the other types of wares. So we have earthenware. We also have stoneware. Stoneware is heavier than earthenware, and this is actually a type of ceramic that is fired in high temperature. So in order for potters to make anything that is stoneware, they had to use a higher temperature. So they had to use a more expensive kiln, more higher end kiln. And so the other type of clay ware is porcelain. Porcelain is the rarest and it's the most expensive. And if you're wondering why porcelain is so expensive, you could say that it's flexible. It's it's a little bit more precious than the other materials when it comes to working with clay. You'll know that a work is porcelain when you hit it and it makes a sound. It makes a ding sound. If you have a porcelain plate at home and you want to try it, you know, just tap it and maybe if it resonates a little bit, it's probably porcelain. If it's just a thud sound, there's no resonance, it's probably earthenware or stoneware. So this this method to create things like plates and bowls, artists have to use what is called throwing. Throwing is when they are shaping clay on a revolving wheel. So throwing is a contraption that allows for material to be spun around. And so you're actually using your foot to step on a pedal, and that speeds up the rotation, the revolving of the table, and that while it's spinning, you can actually create a shape, and it maintains that shape throughout the whole, say, the whole revolution. So every time it spins around, the the potters are able to create a little bit of shape, and it maintains that shape. And so you can actually make some pretty creative shapes using a throwing table. And so the process of working with clay involves a potter wheel. What ends up happening is they have to air dry the piece. So after it is done being spun, after it is being shaped a little bit, they had to just let it air dry for a while. And so after it air dries, they had to put it then in a kiln where they had to fire it, and it'll basically harden the material. And one of the reasons why they had to do all of these things is when the artists are working with this material, there can be bubbles, and so they had to wait for all of that to go away. If they try to fire it while it's still moist, then a lot of those air bubbles are trapped, and it can basically make the inner wall thinner, and it'll just break down easier. So they had to. It's a pretty long process, and so when it comes to decorating these works, they use a slip. A slip is a mixture of clay and water. They also use what is called a glaze, which is a liquid paint with a silica base. And so if we take a look at these examples here, they look a lot like abstract paintings. Very expressive, abstract works of art here. And right away, it looks like a craft because it looks like a type of vessel that people are using to drink with. You could see a little bit of a handle on the side as well. Betty Woodman, Divided Vases, Cubist, 2004. And so this work here shows an example of earthenware. And artists are able to make some pretty contemporary works of art, some pretty abstract and expressive works of art. And here is another example here. A little more on the side of abstraction. Adrian Sachs, Rulers of the Future World, 2004. And so this is actually a bit of porcelain. It's also stoneware. And if you see the design, a lot of these insects, even on the top, there are materials that are made to look like insects. And the idea behind this work is that the artist has this idea that if anything were to happen to humanity, then all that is left over would be the insects. And so that's what Rulers of the Future World was about. So when it comes to working with this material, artists can be on the abstract side. They can make objects that are used for daily living, but at the same time have a little bit of creative value. Peter Volko's Untitled Plate CR 952, made in 1989. And here's another example of a craft being used. It doesn't exactly look like a cup or a bowl, but a little bit more on the side of it being a sculpture. Toshiko Takaezu, Makaha Blue 2. So, Japanese artist here, also using this material to create a little bit more abstract works of art. And so we talked about clay. Now we're going to talk about glass. Glass is chemically related to ceramic glaze. So it is the behavior of it and the process is very similar to a ceramic. It's very similar to a clay process. When it comes to working with this material, there's a wide range of how glass can be manipulated. They can be stained. They can be created by a blown glass. They can be created using inlays. So if you can imagine in the sculpture chapter, we talked a little bit about casting, and so they use the same thing in glass. Instead, it's called inlays. When it comes to working with this material, with the glass material, it's sensitive and it's amorphous when it's hot. In other words, it is very sensitive. It's hot, and so it's basically like a liquid. And what happens is it solidifies when it cools down. The neat thing about glass is that it cools down without crystallizing. When the material is done cooling off, it has a very fluid nature, a very fluid producing line and volume. So it has a very elegant appearance in comparison to clay. And so here is an example of a blown glass work of art here. Very translucent, very elegant. Sea forms by Daily Chihuli, suggesting delicate undersea movements. And so with this material, with the glass material, artists can make some very elegant works of art. It feels very different from clay. And if we look at this example here, what we are looking at is a gurney. You know those tables where scientists or doctors would reel in, specimens. We are looking at a gurney here with a bunch of colored glass objects that look like grenades. And so, why would an artist make colorful grenades and put them on a gurney like this? This work is by the artist Mona Hatome. She researched many explosive devices and recreated them in colorful pieces, quote unquote specimens placed in gurney. And so we can ask ourselves, what is the artist trying to say here with this work of art? It's not exactly aesthetically pleasing, even though there is some interesting things happening with the shapes and the colors. And so what the artist was trying to create here is this idea that humanity, that humans are putting a lot of effort to study explosive devices. Why are humans so obsessed with this idea of destruction? Something along those lines. Don't quote me. I'm just guessing that's what she might be making work about. And so we talked about glass. Now we're going to talk about metal. Metal in the past, they were mainly used for things like tools, also vessels, armor, and weapons. The Muslim culture, you could say they were very adept at working with metal material. They had this unparalleled sophistication. Something about the metal workmanship by the Islamic culture, they actually helped the people in Europe, the many of the Christian nations at the time. During this time, during the 1100s, 1200s, and 1300s, many European countries, many of the Christian European countries, were going through a type of depression. They were undergoing an epidemic, very similar to what, well, not the same, but they had the Black Plague happen in Europe around that time, and because of that, much of the economy went down, and and part of it was because they weren't really doing that much business of outside of their own nation. So when they started to open the doors and they started when these Christian nations started to open their doors and started to mingle a little bit more with the Islamic Church, they were bringing in these different things. They were bringing in these metal objects, and that they were teaching many of these these other nations, these Christian nations, about how to get better at working with metal. And because of that boost that the Islamic culture brought into these European cultures, it helped stimulate the economy. And so not too many people know about that influence, but very instrumental. And so, yes, metal is also a material used by many crafters. And so here's an example of an Islamic work of art here. Part of what gives that away is this very dense pattern of geometric shapes. If you look at the inside, you can see a hint of the Islamic script and calligraphy. Okay, so this is a piece made out of metal, and you can imagine this was made a long time ago, yet it was done with a very high level of sophistication. The Arenberg Basin, 1247 through 1249. And so this is actually made from brass. Of course, brass is one of the metals used in creating these types of objects, things like instruments and plates. Very highly detailed. And so now let's take a look at this work of art here. So right away, you're probably looking at the upper and lower sections. They resemble the globe. And if you look at the center in the middle, you can see the map again. And so it seems like a type of mixed media piece. You can probably guess that the top and the bottom parts were made out of metal. Cal Lane Untitled Map 3, 2007. And what the artist does here combines Middle Eastern style with contemporary messages. In other words, this Middle Eastern style, this Islamic style, a lot of dense geometric shapes and patterns. And what the artist did was he had these 55-gallon drums, these 55-gallon, say, these empty large drums, and flattened them. And that he was able to weld parts together to create very intricate grid pattern in the center, signifying a source of the world's energy, wealth, conflicts, and pollution. So there's a lot of interesting messages going on throughout the whole piece. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about wood. Wood is very different from a lot of other craft materials in that it is a type of living spirit, in that this living spirit of wood offers vitality. It has a different overall quality in terms of the way it feels in comparison to a lot of other materials. Something about wood, it is abundant, it is versatile, and it also has its warm qualities, as we just mentioned. When it comes to crafters or artists working with this material, there's this movement towards sustainability. So whenever artists are working with wood, they have to think about replacing it. So if you're going to end up using wood for, building something, it's good to think about how to replace the wood that you're using. And so this work here by Henry Gilpin, Curiosity Red, right away we look at it and it looks a little bit like a construction table or a work table. And so what the artist did here was he had a tree that was in his backyard and it fell down, and what he ended up doing was he used that tree to make this design. And in a way, he was trying to give life to this object that that ended up falling down from his backyard, and that he was trying to, in a way, memorialize the tree by creating it into this interesting work here. And if we take a look at this example here, this too is actually made from wood. And with this example, you can see how versatile wood actually is. When we think of wood, we think of the difficulty of working with the material, partly because of the grains and how the grains control a lot of the overall shape. But despite that, artists are able to create some pretty abstract, some pretty interesting works of art using that material. Liv Blavarp, Untitled 2002. You can say that it is a very, very geometric shape, but at the same time resembles many natural shapes. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about fiber. Fiber is another type of craft material. Something about fiber, it's mixing the heritage of traditional practices with new avenues of expression. So when it comes to fiber material, you could think of cloth, you could think of blankets, you could think of clothing. And so when this material is being used in art, we refer to it as fiber art. And so there are two classes of fiber art. There are works that were made with a loom, and that's basically the machine that puts together a thread and flattens out the material. And there's also fiber works that are made off of the loom. And so in order for these to be created, there's a lot of this weaving that's happening, this interlacing of fibers. What's going to happen is this interlacing of fibers is going to eventually warp, and then they have the material interlaced on the other side of the object as well. And so if you can imagine these large machines, these looms, they had to carefully use thread, but they had to find ways to interlace them and then tighten them. So interlace them and tighten them, and they just keep doing that method over again. So yes, the loom is a device holding the fibers in place. And so this weft fibers are the cross warp fibers at a right angle. So usually, if you can imagine, a loom will hold these threads at a, say, in a vertical position. So say that you're having this string, you're stretching it out in front of you. You have these strings that are out in front of you, going away from you. The weft fibers are basically the fibers coming from the side. So that the material is more dense and it's a little bit stronger. And the thing about this idea of using these weft fibers, the overall composition can be very sophisticated, very complex, and you'll see examples of that. And if you look at this work here, if you can guess from the works of art we looked at earlier, this also is an example of Islamic art. And what gives that away again is the intricate pattern, the geometric shapes. It's a very important part of Islamic art. And this is a Persian rug. If any of you have heard of Persian rugs in the past, they're very expensive. And this one in particular is called the Ardabil carpet, made in 1540. And in order for this to be made, it required approximately 25 million knots. So you can probably guess it took a very long time to create. So when it comes to these fiber works of art, a lot of them are made into tapestries. So tapestries are these traditional weaving in which carefully ripped and dyed weft threads pulled through stable warps to create pictures. So if you have anything that is made out of cloth, anything that is made out of yarn, if it is a blanket or if it's a cover of some sort, and if there is a design on it, if there is a picture on it, that's a tapestry. And so here's an example of a very large tapestry. And wow, very tall. A lot of really interesting symbolism. And this is Sondok El Donia by Lara Baladi. In other words, in English, The World in a Box. Made in 2007. Large-scale tapestry with hundreds of pictures. It was named after a 20th century Egyptian type of ambulatory street theater. So it's actually made after a type of street theater. Interesting. And in order for these works to be created, for this tapestry to be created, it was actually created using a photographed collage that was programmed on a digital operated loom. So there's actually looms that are digital now, so it can basically create pictures or create photographs. And if we were to zoom in to one of these pictures, this is what it would look like here. Okay. So a lot of detail, a lot of intricate pattern and going on within the tapestry. So I'm gonna go ahead and pause it right here.